Good morning, bonjour, kwekwe, wache, Charlie Angus, Nishinakaz. I'm here today with our leader, Jagmeet Singh, and some people that we have been working very closely with in terms of trying to move the yardstick on justice for the Indigenous children of our nation. The finding of the bodies of the 215 children have shocked Canada, but I don't think it's shocked the First Nation communities of this land who know that there's a long and unbroken line of the denial of basic rights of children going back from the Kamloops school through today. We have a link, of course, is that the Oblates of Mary Immaculata ran that death institution at Kamloops, and the Oblates of Mary Immaculata ran St. Anne's Residential School, some of the survivors who are here. I would like to thank, especially for participating, St. Anne's survivor Marie Sakani, Angela Shashish, Evelyn Korkmaz, Shannon Matatawaban, who represents his father, Edmund, and the Matatawaban family have been really, really important in our ongoing fight to get justice at St. Anne's. And today we are asking the government to stop the legal battles and just to do right. Pleased to be here with Cindy Blackstock, an incredible warrior for this generation of children. And we are asking the government and Mr. Trudeau, and this will be voted on by every member of parliament, that the upcoming court battle to just stop, to sit down and negotiate a solution and to put the children first for the first time with this government. I'm going to turn it over now to our leader, Jagmeet Singh, and then we will carry on. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you for your passion and all the hard work you put into this. I want to thank all the survivors and the warriors and the advocates for children. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's always so difficult to continue to have to share your trauma, but I thank you for doing that. Thank you for your courage, your resilience, and for your words that you'll be sharing with us. Today we are debating our opposition day motion, and in it we are calling for action. As Charlie said, the discovery of those 215 Indigenous children buried in Kamloops has shocked the nation. It has left people reeling. People are in horror. But people are also coming together in incredibly powerful memorials commemorating and reflecting on those children, but also reflecting on what that means about our country. And people are now saying very clearly that it is not good enough to fly the flags at half mast. It is not good enough for the federal government to just express words of condolences, particularly when they are still fighting Indigenous kids in court, particularly when they're still fighting Indigenous survivors in court. So what we're calling for is concrete action. What we're calling for is stopping these legal battles against Indigenous people, stop denying them their rights, respect the ruling of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, work with Indigenous communities instead of fighting against them. And we also want to see the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put in place, 94 calls to action. These aren't recommendations, these are calls to action. And in this moment, when we are reeling from the horror of this discovery, Canadians are demanding action. We are demanding action. And we're going to hear today from people directly impacted by this Liberal government, who on one hand tries to express condolences about the horrific discovery of Indigenous children being buried at a residential school, these kids that were killed in a genocide, and then in the same breath are fighting Indigenous kids in court and fighting survivors in court. And this cannot continue. We're going to have a vote on this motion, and we will see where people stand. If they stand with Indigenous communities, if they stand with and for justice or not. With that, again, thank you so much. Je veux remercier la présence des communautés autochtones, des gens qui militent pour la communauté, les survivants. Merci infiniment pour votre participation. Je veux aussi souligner aujourd'hui notre journée d'opposition, c'est de demander d'actions concrètes. Après la découverte de 215 enfants autochtones à Kamloops, tout le pays était bouleversé. Mais en plus, toute la communauté autochtone, les gens à travers le pays demandent d'actions concrètes. Et ce gouvernement continue de poursuivre en justice les enfants autochtones et les survivants des pensionnats autochtones en justice. On demande que le gouvernement arrête tout de suite de poursuivre en justice la communauté autochtone. Donner la justice, mettre en œuvre les appels à l'action de la CVR. Donc, encore un grand merci. And now I'd like to pass the mic over to Cindy Blackstock, who will share some of the fight and some of the challenges that she's going through on behalf of so many Indigenous children. Thank you, Cindy, for your work. And Cindy, the mic is now yours.
Thank you. So I'd like to honor that I join you from unceded Algonquin territory, and I want to send out my very best wishes to the murdered missing Indigenous women and girls today, as they await what is hopefully going to be real action to end that injustice. The 215 little souls into Kamloops, I think they were sent to us at this time for a special reason. To remind us that the residential school survivors, including the courageous survivors on this call, they told their stories so that their children and grandchildren would not have to continue that injustice. That's why the top call to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to make sure that the federal government funds child welfare properly and fully implements Jordan's Principle, which is named in memory of a little boy who died waiting in hospital for over 2.5 years because the federal government wanted someone else to pay for his healthcare services. It's meant to ensure that First Nations kids get the help they need when they need it. For far too long, since the time of residential schools in 1907, when Canada knew from its own public health officer that they were underfunding health services and that was resulting in the prolific health deaths of children. And that public health officer, Dr. Bryce, spoke up and tried to plead with Canada to save those children's lives. And Canada chose not to do it. Those same inequalities exist for First Nations children today in things like water, in child welfare, health, education, early childhood. In 2007, the Caring Society and Assembly of First Nations filed a legal case against Canada to try and remedy those inequalities that have been well documented by First Nations, the Auditor General, and many others. For 14.5 years now, the federal government has fought that case. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that substantiated the discrimination ordered the government to stop. The government welcomed the decision, and then it did nothing and then very little to stop the discrimination. We were at 19 non-compliance orders and counting. In 2 weeks, we will be going to court where Canada is going to be fighting against First Nations children that directly relate to those first and third calls to action those residential schools left us. The first one, Canada does not want to compensate First Nations children who are wrongfully separated from their families, who are harmed, and in some cases tragically died in relation to Canada's discrimination. It does not want to pay the $40,000 that was ordered to pay back in 2019 to each of those victims. It's arguing that systemic discrimination does not have individual victims. That's a horrible message to send to those children and to the survivors. The second judicial review is against Jordan's Principle. Canada does not want First Nations children off reserve to get access to Jordan's Principle so they get their help that they need. And Canada is doing all this in the name of Canadians, but it's also perpetrating another injustice. It's saying that the reason that they're doing this is because they want to talk to First Nations. Well, it's First Nations litigating against Canada. And even in something even perhaps even more perverse, they're actually putting the children, our children, in the window to shield them from their accountability by saying with their compensation, we want to talk to these children who are taken away from their families. We want to talk to the children who are harmed and the children who are died so that we can decide how much compensation to pay for them. Well, my message is very clear. If the Prime Minister and the government does not think a child's life or a childhood is worth $40,000, then what does he think it's worth? Because to me, each one of these children is priceless. And we owe it to the survivors to stop this litigation, to treat these children equitably, and to always own the accountability for what we're doing now, because this is in the power of Canadians to stop. We can't redo the past, but we can stop this injustice now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your powerful words, Cindy, and thank you for laying out the situation so Canadians know exactly what this Liberal government is doing. They are fighting Indigenous kids in court. They are fighting survivors in court. And now we're going to hear from a survivor. And again, I thank all survivors for being here on this call. Thank you so much for your presence. It's powerful. Knowing that we've got so many survivors here gives weight to this moment. And I want to introduce Evelyn Korkmaz. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and the mic is now yours.
Thank you, Cindy. To all the Kamloops Indian residential school survivors and their loved ones, our thoughts and prayers are with you as the whole world mourns with you. And my heartfelt condolences to Dr. Edmund Matatawaban and family for their loss of their father and grandfather. Abraham Matat was a well-respected chief and elder in the community of Fort Albany, James Bay, who will be missed but never forgotten. He will always live in our hearts. As a residential school survivor, the news of the Kamloops Indian Residential School of 215 innocent children found buried on school grounds was too horrific to take in. Even though I knew, all residential school survivors knew, that there are more Indigenous innocent children buried on residential school grounds across Canada. Now, do you believe us? Do you believe us, Survivors Canada? My question to you, Mr. Prime Minister, is why is the burial grounds not treated like a crime scene? To Canada, my definition of reconciliation is as follows. For the government of Canada to finance, but not to be involved in the investigation of all 139 residential schools, crime scenes across Canada. For Canada to find and identify these missing innocent children and notify their families. For Canada to complete all 94 calls to action immediately. For Canada to stop litigation on St. Anne's residential schools and to honor the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. Canada, you have spent over $3.2 million fighting St. Anne's in court. From 2007 to 2014, the government lawyers hid thousands and thousands of horrific details about the widespread sexual abuse of children at St. Anne's Residential School. They filed false reports for more than 166 survivors. We are fighting for those 166 survivors to have a fair trial on the real evidence. The government will not tell us there is fresh evidence. We are fighting them to enforce the court orders. Is this what you call reconciliation? Enough is enough. You must stop, Canada. For Canada to request all residential school documents stored at the Doctrine of Faith and to have them turned over to the TRC. Canada, no more talk, no more promises, no more crocodile tears. It's time to take action. The Catholic Church also needs to acknowledge and take ownership, to repent and pay for their sins. The time has come to act. No more talk. We're tired of talk. We need action, and we need action now, today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, for your powerful words, for your resilience, for your courage. As a survivor, you are providing a powerful voice for so many other survivors. Thank you so much, Evelyn. Thanks again to Cindy. And at this point, I'd like to pass it back to Nina, who will take any questions from the media that the media might have. Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. So I would like to invite members of the media to please use the raise hand function at the bottom of the page to ask your question and follow-up. J'aimerais ça inviter les membres des médias d'utiliser, s'il vous plaît, la fonction lever la main au bas de la page pour poser votre question et question de suivi. We're going to go ahead and start with Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Thanks so much for taking our questions. I first wanted to go back to, I'm not sure if this is for Ms. Blackstock or maybe Mr. Singh or both of you, but the government says on these continuing court cases, things like this week, the Prime Minister said it's about ensuring proportional compensation for survivors because they had different levels of abuse. Is that something you accept as a rationale for being in court? And if not, why not? And similarly, on the ruling at the Human Rights Tribunal on fighting children now still in care, they say it's about a jurisdiction question.
So I'll start, but I definitely want Cindy to add in as well, Ms. Blackstock, if you do that. But I just want to say how callous that sounds. That the Prime Minister is talking about levels of trauma, that is his response to why he's fighting Indigenous kids in court. His response is that there's more or less trauma. How do you gauge trauma? How do you assess that? It can't be just in the years that you spend in the school. What if something horrible happened to someone in the first year? It is a callous approach, and is not one that respects the realities of Indigenous people. And is not one that is geared towards justice. It is just horrible and wrong that is the approach that the Prime Minister took. And the fact that we've got Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decisions and orders that are being ignored by this government, by Justin Trudeau, is again just a failure to act for justice for Indigenous people on both counts. I want to pass it now to Cindy, please. Cindy will have much more detail and a direct response to this.
It's really important to understand that these victims are still children. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, in making this order for $40,000 a compensation under the Canadian Human Rights Act, said the minimum is $40,000. We say pay out the $40,000 and then you can calibrate from there. Some children lost their lives. So the tribunal has found in an uncontested ruling by the government that their non-compliance since 2016 has been linked to the deaths of 2 children. So we say pay that $40,000 and then yes, you need to pay more to compensate these children. And most importantly, you need to stop the injustices that are happening right now. On a jurisdictional question, that's exactly the excuse that gave rise to the sad situation of Jordan River Anderson dying in that hospital, never knowing what it was to spend a day in a home. Children are not a jurisdictional question. Do the right thing. And if you want to take it up with the provinces or someone else, you can do that later. But what parent, if we would let off the hook of saying, well, I'm not going to help this child get the medical help they need or the educational help they need because it's a jurisdictional question. Canadians don't care about jurisdiction when it comes to kids. They care about kids getting the right kind of help when they need it. And today, the Kids' Rights Index on an international ranking that looks at the country's implementation of child rights proportionate to their health, they found that Canada is placed 54th in the world. So that just shows you how little attention we're really doing to doing the right thing for kids in this country. And just one final thing is to say with the residential school survivors is that Canada is also fighting to Kamloops residential school survivors. And that is very important for people to know.
Charlie?
I would just want to make the real direct connection between why we're here with St. Anne survivors and the children today. The St. Anne survivors were told, come to court. Tell your story. We'll hear your story. And what they were subjected to was legal abuse. They were told that their stories weren't credible. They were told that they were liars because the government did everything to deny them justice. Do you think that the grandparents from St. Anne's are going to let their grandchildren be turned over to the government to be questioned about what level of abuse they suffered? This is what the government is proposing. Trudeau and Bennett have said, we want to hear from the children. What they mean is they want to sick their lawyers on them. That is not going to happen. It'll never be allowed by the communities. They need to pay the money that they're owing and do the right thing.
I just wanted to check before going to follow up if Evelyn, you wanted to say something?
Yes, one thing I missed when I was speaking was we need the audit department of justice to remove lawyers who give legal opinions that do not enforce the law for Indigenous people.
Marika, you have a follow-up? Marika, I think you're on.
I'm wondering, yeah, thank you. I'm wondering, Mr. Singh or Mr. Angus, if you've heard from the government on whether the Liberals will support your motion and what their response has been and what it will say if they do not support your motion.
So far, we've not received any indication in the House of Commons. Other parties have indicated their support in their speeches. So far, we know that the Conservatives have indicated their support. And what this says, if Justin Trudeau and the Liberals don't support this motion, if they don't support the call to stop the legal battles against Indigenous children, against Indigenous residential school survivors, if they don't support our call to put in place all 94, accelerate implementation of the 94 calls to action, it means that this is another example of a betrayal of Indigenous people, a failure to act in justice, and really an insult to this horrible discovery that really shocked and left Canadians reeling, that doesn't shock Indigenous people, but shocked so many people, that then their words were hollow, their words were shallow, that Justin Trudeau didn't mean what he said when he said he was going to implement all the truth and reconciliation calls to action. He doesn't mean that he wants to walk the path of reconciliation, because he still wants to fight Indigenous kids and survivors in court. Charlie?
Well, there will be a vote, and every member of parliament will have to vote with their conscience. And if the prime minister's not going to vote, I encourage Liberals of goodwill to vote with us. And Parliament will give directions to end the legal battles against St. Anne's, and Parliament will give directions to stop the legal battle against the children. And in 2 weeks, Justin Trudeau will have to make the decision to call off his lawyers, because Parliament's called on him to do that, or he's going to ignore the will of Parliament. And I think that would just send a really, really bad message to Canadians at this time.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Next, I have Christopher Reynolds with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Thanks again for taking our questions.
Of course.
A question for anyone who cares to chime in, but initially to you, Mr. Singh. You've mentioned that while the country has been shocked by this discovery last week, that there are people, particularly many Indigenous communities, who are not so shocked, horrified, but not shocked by that discovery. I'm wondering what this says about not just the federal government's actions to address reconciliation and compensation, but what this says about the country as a whole, including provincial governments, including cultural communities outside of the Indigenous realm, about their own personal reconciliations with Canada's history and what Canadians individually have to do to come to terms with that.
I'll start, and then I'll invite anyone else that wants to add. What I think is happening right now is this discovery of the 215 children, this little lives, these Indigenous children, has really created a moment where Canadians are saying and are being confronted with the reality of the genocide of Indigenous people. They're being confronted in a real painful way about something that Indigenous people have known for a long time, that Canada had a clear goal of eliminating Indigenous people. And that is not a goal that ended in the past. It is an unbroken line, as Charlie was saying in his speech. It continues today. That same policy, that same belief that Indigenous lives don't matter, that Indigenous children don't matter, that Indigenous survivors of residential schools don't matter. That is a message that is being perpetuated. And so people are now actually coming together and saying, well, we demand action then. And I think what this moment has created, which is maybe that positive moment that Cindy Blackstock was touching on, that this is a moment that actually has brought together Canadians who are involved in memorials where they're putting little shoes in different places to say, you know what, it's not good enough for the federal government to just say some words. We demand action now. We need action. That the only response to what we saw, what we learned, the only response is to get justice. And there are some concrete steps we can take right now. And that's why we really focused in on some concrete, real things that can happen. And that's why we're tying it directly to stopping these legal battles, because that is a concrete step that can show a new direction that this government can take, that Justin Trudeau can actually start walking the path, that we can actually start moving towards justice. And that's why it's so important that this motion pass, because we want to push for real action, concrete steps for justice. That is the only fair and the only just response to what we're seeing, what we've learned for Canadians, which was so shocking, but as I said, wasn't a shock to Indigenous communities who have already known of these losses, have already suffered the trauma and continue to suffer the trauma. I invite anyone else that wants to add, if they could just give me
Shannon here.
Shannon,
Hi.
okay, yes.
Hi, I just want to say that I'm one of those that is not shocked. We are our hearts are with the Kamloops. There are children, there are nieces, there are nephews that never had an opportunity at life. There are family trees that have never had an opportunity to grow. This is hitting Canada hard because it should. But Indigenous people are always treated differently. This is not taken seriously in Canada. Everybody is in the moment. This is hitting everybody, but there should be an investigation, an international investigation. Anytime you find mass graves or unmarked graves, something happened. And in this point in time, we need to find out what happened. And it's important that this be taken seriously. I come from a community where we know that we have unmarked graves and graves that are there, and the stories are real. But the RCMP came with rakes and made a laughable attempt to try to find remains. That is not the way to do it, to take it seriously. It was an insult to St. Anne's residential school survivors. The Prime Minister made an apology in 2008. It's been 13 years and they're still taking survivors to court right now. They're trying to skirt responsibility and equitable compensation for the harms that they have caused. If you're making an apology, you take it seriously, you implement those TRC recommendations. You make an effort to show that you really care, and that what they have shown so far is not that. Take it seriously, Canada. Indigenous people count too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for that, Shannon. That was powerful. Anyone else on that? Okay, we'll go back to Nina.
Chris, do you have a follow-up?
Very brief follow-up on another subject. Mr. Singh, what do you plan to do about your second dose of vaccine, given that you got AstraZeneca as your first?
I'm open to the public health guidelines. Now that it's been advised that people that took AstraZeneca can mix and match. So I'll take whatever I'm offered as soon as I'm offered. And I encourage everybody to get vaccinated and to take whatever dose that you are able to take, and to follow the public health guidelines around that.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Juste faire un dernier rappel, si les membres des médias ont une question, utilisez la fonction lever la main pour poser votre question et suivi. Just last check to see if there's any more questions. I see no more questions. Je ne vois plus de questions. Alors, ceci met fin à notre conférence de presse. This concludes our press conference. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody again. Thank you so much for being here. Really, really honored. Thank you.
Thank you for doing your work.